his advisor on the military side of the war memoirs. And General Parnell and I were having a light-hearted discussion on suicide, if such a thing is possible. And it seemed that Mr. Churchill was deep in his own thoughts and wasn't listening. And suddenly he jerked upright in his chair and shouted, "Stop it! You mustn't talk like that." He said, "It's not right." Once I almost thought of throwing myself under a train. Well, you can imagine, I mean, silence after that. There wasn't any conversation. Such a shock.
He said to his doctor that he didn't like staying in a hotel with balcony to the room in case he threw himself off, that he couldn't stand near the rail of a ship, that he couldn't stand near the edge of a railway platform, because there was a constant preoccupation with death and with the fear that a mood might suddenly overcome him and that he would throw himself off.
One of his consolations was his love of animals.
There was a time when he was being told that he should entertain more backbenchers at home, and shortly after the war, and one backbencher was put next to him and didn't quite understand that Winston wasn't really in the habit of talking a great deal until he got one or two warm courses of food into his tummy, and on this case particularly taciturn, when suddenly his first sign of life to this backbencher was a great lunge across the fellow, and he said, "Darling." But of course it was the cat who'd come into the room, and Winston felt, there's somebody I really love, and why am I having to put up with the backbencher?
I once went to see him when he was working in his bed during the morning. And there was Rufus, either Rufus 1 or Rufus 2, lying across his ankles. There was the ginger cat, we had no other name for it, on his lap. And there was Toby the budgerigar sitting on his head. And here he was dictating away on some immensely important political document with a secretary behind him. And these three animals sort of hopping round him. Very moving.
Churchill loved watching films in his own cinema at Chartwell. His favourite actress was Vivien Leigh.
He invited Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh to lunch. I remember going into the dining room and seeing Vivien Leigh sitting beside Churchill at the table, and he was just looking at her, and he said to her, quite naturally, "All I want is just to look at you." And you realize that he was spellbound by her beauty.
In February 1950, there was a general election. The Conservatives lost. Clementine had warned Churchill that as opposition leader he had not given of his best. She wrote, "I have felt chilled and discouraged by the creeping knowledge that you do only just as much as will keep you in power. But that much is not enough in these hard and anxious times." Within 18 months, there was another general election. Churchill's renewed energy and the changing mood of the country pointed this time to a change of government.
They made a night of it, sensing that a Conservative victory was on the way.
My mother viewed another term for him as Prime Minister and for her as the wife of the Prime Minister with misgiving. She felt that my father wasn't what he was. The strain of the war had been tremendous, and it took its toll. She accepted what the ballot box said with, I think, a sinking heart.
I changed in the middle of October, the end of October 1951, from being private secretary to Attlee to being private secretary to Churchill. And of course, for long after that, people had come up to me and said, "Tell me, there must be you must find a great difference between the two prime ministers, and I had a party piece already. I used to say, oh, yes, a tremendous difference. You can hardly imagine it. On the one hand, decisive, firm, quick, rapid. He will say, very good, yes, certainly, or no, and so on. And on the other hand, someone saying, oh, I think I'll look at that a bit later, or wait till the weekend and I'll give you an answer, or bring it down to Chartwell. Now, when I said Chartwell, you see, there would be a sort of double take, and all of a sudden they'd realize it was Churchill who was the chap who was keen on putting things off, and actually it was the man who was so decisive and quick about it.
Back in Downing Street, he assembled a new staff, but stuck to his old habits.
It'd be a call of, would one of the secretaries please come to the bathroom, you see, and you'd go and you'd identify yourself outside by a cough, and he'd say, don't come in, and you'd think to yourself, no way, I don't want to go in. And you'd stand outside, and you'd hear these wonderful bathroom noises. You could sort of envisage the sponge being squeezed over the head, the sounds of water trickling down, and occasionally he'd call out, don't go away, and you'd say, no, no, I'm still here. And the sounds of bathing would go on, and sometimes, you know, one really wasn't needed. He'd forgotten what he wanted to say.
And I was putting things on the table or something on his desk or something in the study, which was just outside his bedroom at Churchill, and a voice yelled out, Miss, I'm coming out in a state of nature, you better watch it. And I fled as fast as I could, because, well, there were some things one really...
We were all of us quite young girls at that time. There was no air of salaciousness, and he would go into his bedroom, which was next door, and he would be wearing his siren suit for work. He always wore that, with the zip up the front. And I was not allowed to, I was allowed to help him get it off his shoulders. And he would unzip it down to the waist and no further. And I would help him get it off, and then the rest he would do himself. He was so sweet. I remember one night he said to me, you're very young. Are you 21? And I wasn't. And he said, when you're 21, I'll let you take the whole of my siren suit off.
In June 1953, the new Queen was crowned. Churchill, now Sir Winston, had been persuaded by the Queen to accept the knighthood of the Garter.
He'd been offered it in 1945, and he refused it with the words to the King, I don't think that it's appropriate for me to accept the Order of the Garter from my sovereign when his people have just given me the Order of the Boot. So he didn't accept it the first time, he did the second time from the Queen.
Churchill's main concern as Prime Minister was the military might of Russia. His dream was to save mankind from a Third World War. His means, a summit of the Big Three. When Stalin died in 1953, it was to his successor Malenkov that Churchill turned.
He really believed that he had a mission. This I believe to be true. He had a mission to be as successful in peace as in war.
He had this illusion about our power in the world, or our potential power in the world, if we managed it properly. And he thought that he could talk to the Russians as equals and somehow persuade them to behave properly.
Winston's idea of a summit really was a meeting all alone with Malenkov, without officials and without agenda, he used to say. And this was thought a very dangerous thing by a lot of people. I think they were very much afraid that he might give things away which mustn't be given away, make concessions, weaken the resolution of the West, and upset our main ally.
Churchill went to see Eisenhower, the new President of the United States. They had fought together in the war. Churchill believed they could work together now to end the Cold War. By June 1953, Churchill had exhausted himself again. During a visit from the Italian Prime Minister, he was taken ill at a banquet in Downing Street.
When I went up to my father, I realized something was wrong. He was dazed and he was rather incoherent. And I'm afraid people who talked to him thought probably he'd had rather too much to drink. In fact, what had happened, he'd sustained a stroke.
Despite his stroke, Churchill held a cabinet meeting next morning. He was then driven to Chartwell.
The secret of the fact that he had had a major stroke was amazingly well kept. And the reason really for it was that my father walked unaided from the door at number 10 into his car. But by the time they got to Chartwell, he had to be carried out of the car. And then during the next few days, his stroke got, the effects of the stroke became much more marked and he became practically helpless.
He was partially paralyzed. He couldn't use his left side. So his walking was very, very, in fact, he could hardly walk. His speech was slurred, but his brain was clear.
He recovered much quicker than what he thought. He had his stroke on the Wednesday. On the Friday, Lord Morland said to me that he didn't think he'd live over the weekend. But he started to make remarkable quick recovery.
Newspaper owners were summoned to Chartwell and agreed to keep the truth from the public.
I assumed, as everybody else did, that he would now resign from office. But then he said he would go on if he could recover sufficiently well to make a good speech to the Conservative Party conference at Margate in October.
We were all in the most frightful sweat. My mother longed for him to resign. I mean, to make this, excuse, it would have been comprehensible to all.
A few years ago, nationalization was among socialists.
Everybody was looking at him, particularly those of us who were in government and to some extent in the know, were looking at him rather more closely and perhaps more ordinary. You couldn't detect a thing. He came through it triumphant. He made a very, very good speech.
If I stay on for the time being, bearing the burden at my age, it is not because of love for power or office. I have had an ample share of both. If I stay, it is because I have a feeling that I may, through things that have happened, have an influence on what I care about above all else, the building of a sure and lasting peace.
Churchill now redoubled his efforts to persuade Malenkov, the Russian leader, to agree to a summit.
Curiously enough, it failed because the Russians sent such rude answers to all his efforts. Not for the first time, we were saved by Russian obtuseness. They just brushed him off. Mind you, they were probably just as aware as we were of Britain's weak position. That we were bankrupt and all that, and that they didn't think it was such a big do to have the British Prime Minister. They were interested in the United States.
Churchill crossed the Atlantic again to press Eisenhower to hold a summit, but the Americans were no more interested than the Russians. He now reluctantly accepted that Britain's role had diminished in a world dominated by the two superpowers.
General Eisenhower is at the head of your country at the time when your country has been called upon to become the head of the world.
On his 80th birthday, Churchill was presented with a Graham Sutherland portrait by his former colleague and rival, Clement Attlee.
On behalf of both Houses of Parliament, Prime Minister, I ask you to accept this portrait.
When it came to the actual unveiling of the portrait,
there was an audible gasp from the audience, and clearly it was quite a shock to my grandparents. And my grandfather, when he got up to reply, dealt with it in an absolutely brilliant manner.
The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art.
It was painted in sickly yellows and greens, and there was a hint of a fly button undone. And it was very sad, in fact, that such a splendid occasion should have been upset by this reaction.
The portrait was later destroyed by Lady Churchill.
My mother was perfectly dignified and simple. She said, I saw that it tormented your father, and I promised him that it would never see the light of day.
There were now rumblings from both party and cabinet that it was time for Churchill to step down. He was finding it more and more difficult to concentrate on the day-to-day business of government.
He certainly took less interest in detail and in matters that he didn't find particularly attractive than he had before, and he left much more power to other people.
They provided him with all the equipment, as it were, which they thought for his style of government he would need. And one of them was a great series of tags which they put on his desk, which he'd used greatly in 1945, 40 to 45, which said, "Action this day." And this was put on a number of minutes which were sent out. And he never once used them in 1951 to 55. They lay there on the desk for a long time, but they were never used.
He was losing his grip and not really caring. I don't mean not caring in a nasty way, and of course he cared deeply for his country and so on. But he was just like an old man who'd had enough, I thought.
But Churchill was in no hurry to go, much to the frustration of Anthony Eden, wartime colleague and long-serving Foreign Secretary, who was the acknowledged Crown Prince.
Anthony was getting extremely impatient. He had been, as he thought, promised the prime ministership several times, and each time Churchill had found some reason not to go. One of the reasons being, I have to go and talk to the new rulers of Russia.
He thought he was a better leader than his crown prince and didn't want to hand over. What was it he once muttered? I sometimes remind Anthony that Mr. Gladstone formed his last administration at the age of 81.
And thus make easier the discussions of all the difficult matters and events which will arise from month to month in the next few years.
Eden came to hate Churchill. And after the war, he hated him all the more for blocking him. I think there was great ill feeling between the two, of which probably Churchill was not so conscious. Or he put it to the back of his mind. Churchill simply wanted to stay as long as possible, because he thought that he'd be very lonely without the boxes coming in every day.
He was really afraid of giving up because of the terrible depressions which always overtook him when he did cease to be busy and in the full flood of activity. I think Churchill found it impossible to give up so long as he was capable, in his own opinion, of carrying on.
I remember Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, coming up in the lift, and with very good cause, probably. He had been driven to the end of his tether by the interference from Downing Street in foreign affairs. And he would be saying, well, this time I will resign. This is resignation. And we would all sit on tenterhooks in the office, and the door would be shut. And 10 minutes later, the Foreign Secretary emerged, and he had not resigned.
They all wanted to push Winston out. They all saw he had several strokes, that he really ought to go, but none of them had the guts to go and say to him he should get out. The other thing it's difficult to understand is how the fact, what a great man Churchill had been a few years before, and how this made him almost like a god. You didn't go and talk to gods in a rough way.
With the characteristic cigar clutched in his hand, the evergreen man of 80 years and 4 months sets out to tender his resignation to the young Queen.
In April 1955, after nearly 4 years in office, Churchill had finally decided to resign.
The night before, he had been host to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh at number 10 Downing Street. The statesman who had served as a subaltern in the reign of the Queen's great-great-grandmother and who had served in political office or parliament in the 5 reigns since, has his last public leave taken.
One dream remained unfulfilled, to see the end of Soviet tyranny. But Churchill had prophesied that communism would fail.
The soul of man, frozen in a long night, can be awakened by a spark coming from God knows where, and in a moment the whole structure of lies and oppression is on trial for its life. Peoples in bondage need never despair.
Over the next few years, the south of France became a second home for Churchill. He spent many weeks at a time staying at the Villa La Pausa, not far from Monte Carlo, as the guest of his publisher and literary advisor, Emery Reeves, and his American wife, Wendy.
Wendy had a wonderful sparkle. She would devote herself 100% to his needs. She was a charming conversationalist, and she looked after him in a most delightful way. Her nickname at one time was the Champagne Kitten. She was sort of enormously bubbly and charming and terribly fond of him and did everything to make him happy.
I could call him darling or monkey pie or you bad boy. I could tease him, you see, because I didn't really very often call him Sir Winston when he was here. I would say, good morning, darling, how are you this morning? Or I would say, are you hungry? Eh? You know, I could tease him. I could push him. I could pat him. I could shake him. He liked it, you see. No one ever did that. He felt terribly loved here.
She mothered him. I remember once he was upset about something or other, doesn't matter what it was, and she took his head in her arms and cradled him, and he adored it, just being spoilt.
He was so happy here that, as you know, he came back and came back and came back and came back. When he came the first time, he was to stay 10 days. He stayed 3 weeks. Each time he prolonged and prolonged until finally he was staying. The last 3 or 4 years he stayed more here than he stayed in England.
Tongues had begun to wag, not only behind people's backs. One day at luncheon, one of the women guests, seeing that Churchill appeared to have nodded off, remarked, "What a pity that such a great man should end his days in the company of Wendy Reeves." Suddenly one eye opened. Churchill said, "Wendy is 3 things you will never be. She is young, she is beautiful, and she is kind." And then the eye closed. Inevitably, such gossip took its toll. Churchill's family had become unhappy with his long visits to the Reeveses.
The family concluded that it would be a good thing for him to have a break from that particular background, simply because he wasn't seeing so many of his old friends and themselves. The occasion for that was when he went on a first cruise on the Christina, on Onassis' yacht, where the Reeves were not included, and as he'd first met Onassis in their house, they were understandably rather hurt. Onassis had cabled me saying who should be the guests on this cruise, and there was a list of people, which I had to reply saying this is absolutely okay, but Lady Churchill suggests Wendy and Emery Reeves should not be included. There's a role, not a very agreeable role, I had to play of the surgeon, in a sense.
As Churchill grew older, his links with the past brought him happy and nostalgic moments. He would go to Harrow, his old school, for songs. He was still honoured as a world statesman. He was still a member of Parliament, returned by his faithful constituents in Epping. Frail though he was, he would go regularly to the Commons, listening to debates, but rarely speaking. In 1964, aged 89, Churchill finally retired. He had been a member of Parliament for more than 60 years.
I'd found him very unhappy and melancholy, and he was sitting after dinner and brooding. And I asked him why he was so melancholy. This was after his retirement, and pointed to his extraordinary achievements, both in politics, in the armed forces, having won the war. If you can put it down to a single man, it was he. Of course you can't. And things like the Nobel Prize for Literature, a large family, all loved him. And with all that, he was popular. I said he'd had a life that was given to very few people. Why was he so gloomy? And he said this, yes, you're right. I have worked very hard all my life, and I have achieved a great deal, in the end, to achieve nothing. And what he meant was that his ideals, if they could be summed up, was a strong and united British Empire and Commonwealth in a totally peaceful world.
Of Churchill's last year, his daughter Mary wrote, "The pace of his life was like a broad, weary river, gently meandering on. Sometimes he withdrew a great distance from us, and who knows what thoughts or images moved across the screen of his consciousness from the long saga of his life."
Because he said he didn't like old age. Old age is intolerable. Oh, yes, I think he was very sad. Fortunately, his eyesight was very good, and he was able to read. He read Hornblower and that sort of thing, which he enjoyed enormously.
I went to lunch with him, and we lunched alone. We lunched in the garden, and he was in a sort of reminiscing mood about things and happenings and he said to me, "I have done my bit. I should be allowed to depart in peace." And it was terrible because you realized that, you know, there was nothing anymore that he could do, therefore he didn't want to go on. The end was not the greatest time for him.
In January 1965, Churchill suffered a massive stroke and went into a coma. The crowds gathered for news outside his home in Hyde Park Gate in London.
I chiefly remember the great sort of stillness in our house and the throng of people outside, totally quiet crowd, but a very sad one, and also the feeling as the days went by that in a way the whole world seemed to be with us. And inside the house, it was very peaceful. My father just really faded away over a series of days. He became deeply unconscious. And yet I know that until a very short time before his death, the nurses always used to tell me that they knew that he knew when my mother was sitting by his side. And she used to sit there for hours by his bed, holding his hand. It was a very peaceful scene, really. He had a dear orange kitten, which was a fairly new acquisition, and that used to lie curled up on his bed, and we used to come in and out, and it the grandchildren came up to say their goodbyes. My children were rather small, but I'm glad they saw him looking so peaceful. And one of them said to me, "I don't think I shall ever be frightened of death." And then he died about 8 o'clock on Sunday, the 24th of January, 1965.
Approaching the west door, I saw an enormous marble plaque on the floor, and on it the legend, "Remember Winston Churchill." I thought to myself, how could anyone forget him? The man who not only saved Britain, but really saved the whole world from Nazi domination.
Last time I spoke to you, I quoted the lines of Longfellow which President Roosevelt had written out for me in his own hand. I have some other lines which are well known, but which seem apt and appropriate to our fortunes tonight. And I believe they will be so judged wherever the English language is spoken or the flag of freedom flies. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making, comes silent flooding in the main, and not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward, look, the land is bright.